Today on Better Book Clubs, it's time to see how I did with my reading goals for 2023. So if you've been following my channel, you know that every year I set myself some reading goals that have nothing to do with the number of books that I read or the number of pages I read, but instead I set myself some goals for the kinds of books I want to read. The idea behind this is to make sure that there's a diversity in the books that I'm reading, that there are categories set up to help me kind of make sure that I cover a whole bunch of different bases and I don't get stuck in a rut in my reading habits. And every year I set maybe 7 or 8 categories that I want to read in, and then I just kind of go off and read. And at some point during the year, I do a check-in and see how I'm doing and try and get myself back on track if I'm missing something. And then at this time of year, at the very end of the year, I check in and see how I did, and I set my goals for next year. So let's take a look at what I said I was going to read this year, and then I'll fill you in on how I actually did. So the first category, which I've been including on my list every year for the past few years, is a classic I haven't read before. I actually did really well in this category this year. I read 4 classics that I had never read before, and one of them I want to talk about a little bit in more detail because it wasn't in my mid-year check-in. So I read 1984, George Orwell. I read Elizabeth Gaskell's novel, Cranford. I read a really sweet little book by Nathaniel Hawthorne called 20 Days with Julian and Little Bunny, which is just kind of like a little diary of 20 days in which he was taking care of his little boy while his wife was away. And then I read David Copperfield. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about David Copperfield at the end of this video. I did not do so well in the category of poetry. So I had good intentions of reading poetry this year, and I kind of dabbled in it. I read bits and pieces of poetry, but I never managed to finish a full collection. And for a while I was working on this collection that my friend Heather recommended to me. It's called American Journal, 50 Poems for Our Time, and it's edited by Tracy K. Smith. It's a good choice because it's all different poets. And so if you don't like one, you might like another. And for a while, I was reading one every night. At some point, I got stalled out. I know exactly where I got stalled out. I got stalled out in a big reading project I've been working on this fall, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. So I'm going to come back to this. Poetry is not going to be one of my reading goals for 2024, but I am going to keep reading this book, and I'm going to see if I can pick out a poet from this book that maybe I'd like to read a full collection of. In the category of science fiction, I did okay. I read 1984, so I'm going to double dip on that one. I also read part of Ted Chiang's collection, Exhalation. I'm maybe like 2/3 of the way through it. I've been reading one story at a time, but I have to admit that while I find these really clever stories, like stories that make me think about science fiction, the concepts that Chiang comes up with are really creative and thoughtful and thought-provoking, but the writing itself I find pretty sterile, I guess. He's really good with ideas, but on a sentence level, I'm not as excited about reading this collection, so I am going to finish it. I don't get credit for finishing it in 2023, and I actually don't think I'm going to bring science fiction into my goals for 2024, just because there are so many other goals to set, but I am going to finish this collection and keep my eye out, I guess, for some other science fiction, new science fiction that people are really excited about. I also accomplished my goal of reading a work of prize-winning nonfiction. I read a book called Say Nothing about the conflict in Northern Ireland, and it was a really excellent history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I also just read a lot of prize-winning fiction, which was not one of my goals. And I actually read quite a bit of nonfiction. It just wasn't prize-winning. Some of it was best-selling. I did really well in the category of nonfiction. So in all of these categories, these first 4, I did really well. I did pretty well in the category of humor as well, and I've been chipping away at this one for several years. I find it difficult to find good humor books. And I would say that the books that I read this year that I found humorous are not necessarily shelved as humor, not necessarily sold that way. So I mentioned a couple of these in my mid-year check-in. One of them is The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. The other is How to Be Perfect by Michael Schur. And I found both of those books to be laugh out loud funny at times, even though they weren't really pitched that way. And then I also read Tracy Flick Can't Win, which is fiction. And I talked about all three of these in my earlier video, my mid-year check-in. So I'm not going to spend too much more time talking about them, but I do feel like this is a really underexplored category, because as a reader, I find it really hard to find good humor books. There's something lacking in the way the publishing industry is buying them or understanding what humor is. So I'm going to keep looking for good humor books, I think probably in 2024, and see what comes to me. So I'm going to take a little pause here and talk about number of books, because I know sometimes people are curious about that. So I still have about 10 days left in December when I'm recording this video, and I've completed 28 books this year, and I probably will finish 3 or 4 more, depending on, I'm pretty close to finishing 3 more, maybe 4. So I'll probably break 30 this year, which is actually really good for me. It's interesting because when I used to set myself a number of books goal, 30 was always the number I was shooting for. And so without trying to read that many books, it's just kind of happened this year. One reason for that is that I'm writing a Substack now, and every Wednesday I do just a quick little feature on what I'm reading this week. And I'm always writing about it when I'm in the middle of reading. So they're not book reviews, they're more like just kind of quick meditations on how it's going, where I got the book from, what I'm thinking about it. Somehow that practice of writing about a book that I'm in the process of reading every week has sort of kept me on track for continuing to read at a good steady pace. So it's interesting that even though the goals I'm setting for myself are really about breadth of content and not about numbers, I'm actually reading more books than I used to in a year when I had a number goal set. I'll get to some of my favorite books of the year in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about the other 3 categories I had set for myself that I did not do so well in this year. The first of my missing categories I totally bombed out on. It's a contemporary book in translation. I just didn't read anything in translation that was written, within the last 10 years. It's partly because those books, they don't just fall into your lap. You have to go out and look for them. And I didn't consciously go out and look for them. I'm going to move this category into 2024 and really pay better attention to the books that are written in another language and translated into English that are really getting good reviews and getting some buzz, and will be books that'll be really interesting to read. I just blew it this year. I also said I wanted to read a book published by a small press, and I did manage to accomplish that, but I feel like it was just kind of accidental, and that I really should be paying more attention to what the small presses are publishing. The small presses are not under the same kind of pressure to make money. Of course, they have to be financially solvent, but they're not trying to satisfy shareholders or make the big bucks. What they really have is a mission to publish the best books. I'm a little bit disappointed in myself that I didn't pay more attention to small press books that came out this year, or even in the past few years. But the one book that I did read that was a small press book is a book called Downriver by a writer named Heather Hansman, and the subtitle is Into the Future of Water in the West. I really enjoyed this book. I would highly recommend it. It's about the water crisis in the West, and I spent 3 weeks in Colorado this summer. I've lived in Colorado, so I'm aware of the water issues there, but spending some time there and actually going to the Headwaters Museum in Fraser, Colorado really got me thinking more about the issue. So this book is fascinating because what Hansman does, she's a whitewater rafter, and what she does is she travels the entire length of the Green River from Wyoming down. There's a little bit of Colorado and then into Utah. And for parts of the trip, she's completely by herself out on the river. For other parts, she has people with her, and obviously she often stops and, leaves the river to stay somewhere for a few days, do some interviews, talk to people about issues along the river. So this is a great example of actually a really important book. It's about an important climate-related issue. It's also really well written. It's exciting. It's an adventure story about, rafting the entire river. And this is a small press book. It's actually a University of Chicago press book. It came out in 2019 and highly recommend it. It's a quick read, but it's actually very informative. So I took a lot of notes while I was reading it and thinking about these issues. Here's an argument for small press books. This brings me to the project that I've alluded to a couple of times. And I had on my list this year a category that I sometimes include, and that is the category of a book everyone is talking about. And it doesn't happen every year, but I predicted back in September, it was pretty obvious already, that Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver was going to be the book of the year that everybody's talking about. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It actually co-won it with the novel Trust, which by Hernan Diaz, which I also read and really enjoyed. I am a little more than halfway through Demon Copperhead as of this video, but I'm planning to finish it by the end of the year. But the project I alluded to that I've been working on all fall was, before reading Demon Copperhead, I decided I wanted to read David Copperfield. And I've mentioned already that I did read this as a classic that I hadn't read before. I just felt like in order to appreciate Demon Copperhead to the fullest, I wanted to have read David Copperfield first, and I had never read it before. It's a pretty weighty book. It's over 800 pages long, but I really enjoyed it. So I will do a full video when I'm done with Demon Copperhead on whether you need to read David Copperfield first, and the extent to which it really informed my reading of Demon Copperhead. I already have some thoughts about that, but I will say that this book was one of my top 3 favorite books of 2023. Dickens is interesting because he has kind of an interesting reputation. Some people feel like he's sort of a B-list writer from the 19th century. Like he's more of a popular writer. He's just not as great as some of the 19th century classic writers we have. And then other people love Charles Dickens. And I have to say, he's an incredible storyteller. He's funny. His characters are really interesting and well fleshed out. His plot moves right along. There were a couple of spots where my friend Susan, who was doing this with me, and I got a little bit bogged down, but for the most part, this was just a delightful novel. I would highly recommend it. This was one of my top 3 reads of 2023. Interestingly, my list of my top 3 favorite reads of the year is kind of an illustration of this project of trying to read broadly. So David Copperfield was one, and of course that's a classic novel from the 19th century. Another one of my top 3 favorites, I can't show you because I've already loaned it out to a friend, but it's a novel that was nominated for the Booker Prize this year. I think it was on the short list, by Paul Harding. Harding is just a really beautiful writer. He understands how to craft sentences, how to put words together. He could write almost anything and it would be pleasurable to read. What I especially loved about his novel that came out this year, it's called This Other Eden, was that it's also historical fiction, which is one of my favorite genres to read in. It's based on a true story of a community of mixed race people, fishermen mostly, living on a small island right off the coast of Maine, very close to the coastline. And for the most part, people leave this community alone. It's a very small, tight-knit community. kind of intermarried, and so everybody's sort of related to everybody else in some way, and they don't live the way people on the mainland live. And so that makes things dangerous for them because they are outsiders not only geographically but also socially. So the historical event that this is based on is the fact that eventually people from the mainland come out and destroy their community. And so Harding imagines this event from the inside, from the perspective of the islanders. I felt like it was a really successful book in terms of the plot, in terms of the characterization, in terms of the language. It was just beautifully done and highly recommended. This Other Eden by Paul Harding. And then my third choice of the year is a nonfiction book. So again, illustrating the breadth of my reading this year. It's called Why We Sleep: Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams by Matthew Walker. And this book, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it changed my life. I mean, I knew sleep was important. I've always been kind of vigilant about getting my 8 hours of sleep. I'm a pretty good sleeper. People in my family are not. I am worried about that. I know that there are consequences for not sleeping, and I always used to think when my kids were younger and there were those moms who were doing everything, you knew they were doing everything by sleeping 4.5, 5 hours a night. And I just was never going to go there. It turns out that even I learned a lot from this book about how important sleep really is. And what Walker calls it, what the science calls it, is a sleep opportunity. So you may not be a good sleeper, you may not be able to get 8 hours of sleep every night, but you should be giving yourself an 8-hour sleep opportunity at least. There's so much fascinating research about how we sleep and why we sleep and how we dream and why we dream, what our brains are up to at night. And I just found it absolutely compelling. I have to really be better about helping my whole family get their 8-hour sleep opportunity. I mean, that's the bottom line from this book. Everybody should be concerned about sleep. Even if you already are, even if you already understand how important it is, this book will teach you a lot. So Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker is my third choice for my favorite book of 2023. So that's my roundup of how my reading went in 2023. And what comes next is setting my goals for 2024. But you'll have to wait until after the new year to hear about those. I'll be back soon with that list. And in the meantime, I would love to hear what you've been reading in 2023. What were your favorite books? Leave them in the comments section below, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.